thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's miserable out, or it was at least. It's a little bit better now, but thank you all for coming and filling this room for what promises to be a very interesting event. Our guest today is Yuri Andrukhovych. The opportunity came to have Yuri present here on the occasion of not one but two of his books came out this year in English translation, and in two genres that have been slow coming of Yuri's works, because he works in poetry, he writes prose fiction and essays. So we'll be reading from this book, My Final Territory, Selected Essays, which is published by University of Toronto Press this year. I'm one of three translators that worked on this book of Yuri's essays that span from his earliest essays to an essay about the Euromaidan. So we'll be reading a few fragments of that. Yuri will read them in the original, and you'll have the translation available on the screen behind me. And we will also be, and these are premieres, first time ever, you can say it someday, of works from this book that just came out a little bit after my book. That's Ostap Vitaly Chernetsky and Ostap Keen translated, and these are Yuri Andrukhovych's poems, and the book's entitled Songs for a Dead Rooster. It came out, it's really hot off the presses, so there wasn't a chance for the bookstore to get a copy to sell tonight, unfortunately, but you can order it online. But My Final Territory is available for purchase in the back corner there, so be sure to take a look if you're interested.
We also have some
and we also have
books from Ukraine.
For those that read in Ukrainian, we have a collection. These are among Yuri's latest books. This is a collection of travel essays that was published, about 5 years ago? Maybe.
It was 2011.
2011, and then this is hot
the
off
newest
the presses,
one.
The newest novel, the Darlings of Justice, Kоханці Юстиції. So, and Yuri also has these available for purchase. The format of the event will, in addition to the readings, we'll have a bit of a discussion, and Ostap Keen will present some of his translations. We're happy that he's able to take part again, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions to Yuri yourself. So with that, let's welcome Yuri Andrukhovych to the Harriman Institute. Welcome.
Дуже дякую. I'm not sure my microphone is working. Yeah?
Good enough?
Okay, thank you very much. Добрий вечір. Good evening. Last time I was here 2016, but not in that very nice space, very nice room. So let's start.
Okay, so we will start with and one of Yuri's first essays, and we will read. Yuri will begin reading in Ukrainian. Maybe we'll say a few words about what you'll be reading, and then when you start reading, we'll get the translation going.
The title of this essay is a little bit playful, something between Greek and Latin, scientific traditions, and it is CARPATOLOGIA COSMOPHILICA. It is actually one of my very first essays. I started writing essays in the 1990s, and this is actually the important feature of that collection, My Final Territory, because you, as the readers, you can follow some kind of my evolution as an author of essays, because this is a very special genre, and I started writing it after I was an author of 3 poetry books and 3 novels. So it was something like new beginning of my writer's career. A little bit skeptically in the beginning. I couldn't understand what the purpose, what the sense of essayistics could be. But then I tried to do it myself, and CARPATOLOGIA COSMOPHILICA is one of the very first essays written in 1995 or 1996, maybe on the edge between those 2 years. And I will read an excerpt devoted to the music as a kind of Central Eastern European Carpathian essence. And you can follow it in English translation by Mark Andrejczyk. Нелегко знайти в цьому світі музику більш земну від гуцульської. За рівнем біологічної напруги, тілесності, сексу і смерті може їй дорівнятися хіба що румунська музика, або циганська, або музика гуралів, або мадярів, або словаків, або лемків. Здається, гуцульська музика ще є, хоч уже завтра її може не бути. Більшість із нас навіть не зауважить цього, насамперед самі гуцули. Сьогодні багатьом із них цілком вистачає навіть не Мадонни, а Маші Распутіної. Імперія московської попси не поступилась ані п'яддю своїх територій. Її кордон, як і раніше, сягає на заході Чопу і Мостисьок. Ця імперія кіосків диктує свою волю, точніше волить себе. Гуцульська музика вироджується в кіч. Центральна Європа Косова і Рахова вимивається в Євразію. Робиться плацдармом, по якому безперестанно рухаються на захід уніфіковані, а краще сказати інфіковані граждані СНГ. І вони замовляють свою Машу Распутіну. А що залишається нам? Музика чи не єдина реальність у примарній структурі Центральної Європи? Музика надає сенсу розмовам про єдність і унікальність. Вона перебуває поза всіма хронічними конфліктами і стереотипами. Її сюжети мандрівні, а персонажі універсальні. Безумовно, цієї музики ніколи б не було на світі, якби не Карпати. Можлива і зворотна залежність. Не було б Карпат, якби не ця музика. Усе інше – взаємні претензії, атаки, загарбання, асиміляції – кожен завинив перед кожним. Виживання коштом слабшого, висмоктування сировини, дешевшої робочої сили, гірське розбійництво, демонстровані на роздоріжжях відрубані голови, релігійні чвари і просто п'яна різанина. Спорудити на цій підставі якусь новітню спільноту, крім мафіозної, мабуть, настільки ж нелегко, наскільки нелегко знову переписати історію, єдиним імпозантним відтинком якої може не цілком виправдано здаватись утопія Дунайської монархії. Найпрагматичніші з політиків уже зорієнтувалися в дійсному стані речей. То що залишається нам? Ходити в гірські виправи, записувати фольклор, спостерігати за небесними тілами ангелів крізь діряві шатра нечинних обсерваторій, відшукувати старі трактати, відроджувати астрологію, розчищати праоснови культур від причинно-наслідкових нашарувань, рятувати гуцульську музику, чи може очікувати з-за океану велике прибуття яєчних лушпайок. Як особлива метанаука майбутнього, карпатологія ще не виробила остаточних відповідей на ці та інші засадничі питання. Достеменно відомо тільки таке. Карпати – це велика скоба, що тримає вкупі схильні до хаотичного розповзання частини буття. Карпати – це велике сейсмічне зусилля, зона особливих енергетичних можливостей і напруг. Карпати ділять у сенсі земному, але об'єднують у сенсі космічному. Напевно, обидва сенси є рівною мірою необхідними і визначальними. А якщо так, то це початок діалогу. Важливо, щоб він не мав завершення. В усьому ж іншому варто покладатися на того, що сам ні початку, ні завершення не має. And no end.
Thank you, Yuri. As you mentioned a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about how you got into in the genre of the essay. Poetry has traditionally been the strongest genre for Ukrainian literature, and you were first known as a poet, as the patriarch of the Bubabu.
And this is quite typical thing. The young authors usually begin by poetry, by poems. In the age of 15, 16, they start by poetry, and me too.
But then you became, I think the way I see, you saw a need for another genre in Ukrainian literature, a niche that needed to be filled, and you quickly became the leading writer of fiction in Ukraine with your novels, especially the first three, Recreations, Moscoviada, and Perversion. And they addressed this need for an innovative, kind of a new voice in Ukrainian fiction. And then you went on to essays, as you mentioned before, and continued to write fiction, but we will talk a little bit about the poetry. In your first essays, among which the one you just read an excerpt of here, I think your first essay was Introduction to Geography of Stuptogeografia,
right.
Which was in a journal, Preroma, 1993. And if we're talking early 90s, there weren't many books published yet of these works. These wonderful, now legendary works will be published in journals such as these, or in the wonderful Suchasnist magazine, the intellectual scene. And in fact, in this is a journal, double journal. It's a complicated story about Chetver, which Yuri Andrukhovych and Yuri Andrukhovych were together, putting together and publishing, and it published much of the really interesting literature of the time in Ukraine. In the 1996 issue, there is a rubric dedicated to essays. And in it, and Yuri's essay Erz Herz Perz, which is translated in My Final Territory, is in there. Yuri writes you write a couple sentences about what these essays are to be. So I think it's kind of interesting to start there. You talk about a coexistence of time and space, of history and geography, of our new nostalgia, of a balance between individuality and community, of patriotism and cosmopolitanism, of the universal and the national. And to talk about important things but doesn't mean that you cannot look at it with an eye that's winking a bit. And in addition to Erz Herz Perz, in there you have essays by Igor Pomerantsev, a British Russian author who lived and studied in Chernivtsi. They're presented in this journal. So my question is,
it was, by the way, huge pleasure to translate his essay from Russian into Ukrainian. It was somehow a new challenge for that time to do something which could look like absurd translation from Russian into Ukrainian, but I'm sure it is very important thing to translate the Russian literature into Ukrainian, because I'm sure there will be a time in the future when Ukrainians will not understand Russian very good. So we have to translate the best works of Russian literature right now into Ukrainian.
When you chose to focus on essays in these journals, was it also, did you see there was a need for this genre in Ukrainian literature like you did with the fiction? Was it because you could publish a complete essay in a journal like this and not a fragment of a novel? Why did you decide at that point to focus on essays, and from that point on today?
Yeah, I can remember this situation. So the first half of 90s, and it was a time I got my first traveling experience, being invited to some Western European countries, and so I spent my first longer stay in 1992 in Germany, and it was my first stipend. I got it as a writer, and I spent 3 months in an area of Munich, in Bavaria, and it was a very nice place, some villa devoted for artistic projects and for the meetings between writers and painters and other artists from mostly from Eastern European countries. And I met there some significant people like Georgian, big Georgian director and writer, and he's also he's a person who wrote a lot of screenplays for very famous movies. His name is 𝐒𝐨𝐬𝐬𝐿 Gabriadze, and at the same time there was as a guest in the same villa Russian writer Andrei Bitov, and we had some discussions about what should we do now in that place. This is a beautiful, wonderful place with a very concentrated atmosphere, good for writing, for creation, but it is sometimes, it seems to be too beautiful. You cannot write there because the villa and the place is so beautiful that you are just like paralyzed by this beauty there. And I think it was 𝐒𝐨𝐬𝐬𝐿 Gabriadze who said the best thing is to write the essays here, because essay is a kind of a perfect synthesis of poetry and novel. Nevertheless, I wrote there my second novel, Moscoviada, but after I came back home, I had a kind of very deep nostalgia concerning to this place in Bavaria, and I tried somehow to reconstruct my feelings and my emotions and my thoughts. Actually, my situation there, and so I came to the idea I have to write my very first essay, and it was this introduction to geography. So maybe
and
it would be an answer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think maybe later we can talk about geography as being and maps being a major, and even the cover you can see is a major topic and theme in your essays. There are, like I mentioned before, in addition to these kind of older essays, there are a few newer ones. There's one on the city of Pripyat, and that is actually one of the cities visited in this book, but that's translated for this. And Yuri will now read
the difference is the title here is the Star Absent, and lexicon. This book has a structure of alphabet, so I needed to have some city with the letter X, I mean, the first letter of the name, and I couldn't find something like this. So the city of Pripyat appears in that book as X city.
And so now Yuri will read an excerpt from that.
I will mention here Walter Mossmann. It was a very, very important person for me, a very good friend of mine, a German poet, songwriter, activist, and he belonged to this generation of 68, of the year 68. So he was a very very colorful person who visited this dead city of Pripyat 1 year earlier than me, and so going to this city, I had already Walter's experience a little bit in my consciousness, because I read his reports, his notices written about his visit there. У своїх нотатках про Прип'ять Вальтер Мосман називає це місто ні з чим не порівнюваною інсталяцією. Я також іноді не міг позбутися враження, що все навколо є радше фрагментами свідомо створеної і далі методично розбудовуваної експозиції всередині такої собі Contemporary Art and Ecology Zone. Тільки от куратори місцями дещо перегнули палицю, від чого теж місцями їде дах у дозиметрів. Зрештою, не тільки в них. Той самий Вальтер Мосман трохи нижче зізнається. Ціле місто є інсталяцією з настільки багатьма Bedeutungsebenen, що аж у черепі гуде. Підхоплюючи його черепове гудіння, намагаюся перелічити хоча б найвищі із Bedeutungsebenen, тобто сутнісних рівнів. Немов збираюся формулювати запитання, в чому семіотика Прип'яті. Цих рівнів навіть у мене назбирується більше, ніж 2. Ось хоч би й перша п'ятірка. Екологічний, політичний, соціальний, ліричний, міфологічний. У зв'язку з останнім випливає передусім він, друг людей і ворог богів, сам надлюдина і недобог, цебто титан. Це Прометей, а не жоден Саваоф чи Єгова створив людей з глини. Яке слово найперше зринає в нашій асоціативній свідомості, щойно чуємо його ім'я? Правильно, вогонь. А мало би бути глина, хоч і червона. Значення викраденого в богів задля людей вогню можна осягнути тільки з урахуванням фактора глини, себто тієї обставини, що Прометей мусив піклуватися про свої глиняні витвори. До речі, у слові «піклуватися» мені так і вчувається опік. Глина твердне і набирає сили внаслідок опалення. Від вогню нам нікуди не дітися. Якщо вогонь спалахує в ядерному реакторі, то й поготів. Прометей – улюбленець романтиків. Це вони один за одним, ніби змовившися, оспівали в ньому саможертовний бунт проти усталеного порядку речей. Не дивно, що Шевченко в «Кавказі», поемі, перш усього конкретно політичній, для початку мусить відштовхнутися від нього на 30 тисяч років, от іще, строк ув'язнення, прикутого до наскельної поверхні. Стає в нагоді і орел, хоч навряд чи... Пропав.
Зараз знайдемо. X, right?
Уже є. Де той орел? Навряд чи двоголовий, та все одно самодержавний пожирач печінки. У соцреалістичну добу Прометей залишається серед улюбленців, тепер уже пізньорадянської електроенергетики. Він є своєрідним патроном усе нових електростанцій та прилеглих до них населених пунктів. Так, наче саме він сформулював гасло про електрифікацію всієї країни. Зрозуміло, що Прип'ять не могла не бути одним із центрів його культу. Черговий удар з боку жадібних і хтивих богів прийшовся в реактор. По-друге, звичайно, зірка, чи точніше звізда. Звізда Полин. Вірші 10 та 11, розділу 8, «Откровення Івана Богослова» почали в нас активно цитувати вже з літа 1986-го, себто за якийсь місяць після катастрофи. Полин – дуже дивна, просто таки безглузда назва, якщо йдеться справді про зірку. І навіть якщо під зіркою мається на увазі комета чи метеорит. З чого б то космічному тілу носити назву польової рослини? Свого сенсу вона раптово набуває лише у зв'язку з місцем катастрофи. Таким чином, полин – це подвійне «а» – апокаліпсис і абсент. Обидва є своєрідними екстрактами. Перший – таємного знання, другий – гіркоти. Якби географічні назви перекладалися, то на міжнародному рівні мова б велася не про ЧАЕС, а про ААС, як і про техногенну катастрофу не в Чорнобилі, а в абсенті. Є ще, звичайно, третє «а» – ангел. Так само третій – той, що засурмив. Чи не його бачимо серед інших фігур на згадуваному вітражі в кафе, як ще один помпейський привіт художника? Він, хоч і замаскований під летючу дівчину, груди, хоч і з невидимими крилами, та все ж наділений сурмою, як головною і вирішальною ознакою. Ангели не можуть мати жіночих статевих ознак, тим більше первинних, бо ангели статі не мають. Проте ангели можуть прикидатися дівчатами. Довге волосся, як і відсутність чоловічих статевих ознак, навіть і вторинних, дозволяють. Той ангел, що летить на вітражі, мабуть, із таких. Його автор не знав, але здогадувався. А здогад часом куди разючіший від знання. Дякую. Thank you.
Thank you. We will return to the essay genre before we get to the question and answer period, but now we'll turn to this latest publication of poetry, and I'll invite Ostap Kin, one of the translators of this book, to read together with Yuri some poems from this book. Ostap.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marco, for inviting me to participate in this event. As Marco already mentioned, Songs for a Dead Rooster has been just published by Lost Horse Press, a press in Idaho, as the second volume in their Ukrainian contemporary poetry series. Like in case with My Final Territory, Songs for a Dead Rooster is the first comprehensive selection of Yuri's poetry in English translation. The poems in this collection try to bridge two distinct periods of Yuri's body of poetic work. That is the first one of 1980s and early 90s, as well as the second from early 2000s. The imageries in these poems, as well as the language itself, is baroque, grotesque, sensuous, funny, ironic. Basically, everything that we like and appreciate in Yuri's writing in general and poetry in particular. So I guess we'll move to reading poems, first in Ukrainian to be followed by English translation.
Yeah, it is a big joy for me to have this book. Actually, I'm holding it for the first time now, so you are the witnesses of my first meeting with my newest book. It is bilingual, so we have Ukrainian original and English translation, and there are, as I see, there are 3 translators.
Yes.
I never knew that you made some of them together with somebody who is completely enigmatic for me, but whose name is Adam Brodsky.
Adam Brodsky, yes.
So a kind of mixture between Adam Mickiewicz and Joseph Brodsky, I hope. But we will read a few poems in your... the third translator is actually, I think he's an initiator of this book, Vitaly Chernetsky. And he has chosen the second part of this book, so the poems called actually Songs for a Dead Rooster, which are which were written later. It is the so to speak, the new wave, the newest wave of my poetry, although the very last of them has been written in 2004, so it is a quite long time. I don't write the poems again, but you, Ostap, you have preferred to
Earlier.
Yeah, and so all of them come from 80s, actually from my second volume of poetry called in Ukrainian СЕРЕДМІСТЯ. So, the English title could be Downtown, maybe.
I think this is how it's often translated.
Університет. Ми послуговуємось мертвими мовами, ходимо безпорадні серед астролябій, реторт, черепів. З висоти земляного валу слухаємо, дзвін Миколая на брукованому подвір'ї слухаємо, красномовного ритора, заляпаного крейдою Цицерона. На уроках медицини зазираємо в очі мерцям. Ховаємо в кишенях тютюн і нецнотливі малюнки. Вранці чемно ступаємо за капеланом. Жбурляємо в котів малими філософськими камінцями. Опівдні втікають від нас найдотепніші силогізми і формули, адже поруч за крутими вогкими мурами саме розвішує щойно випрану, мокру, ваговиту білизну медова служниця підстарости.
University. We use dead languages. Helpless, we walk along retorts, along astrolabes and skulls. From the heights of ramparts, we listen to the clanging of St. Nicholas on pavement. We listen to the eloquent rhetorician Cicero, filthy with chalk. During medical lessons, we peep into the eyes of dead people. We hide tobacco and sleazy sketches in our pockets. In the morning, we obediently follow our chaplain. We throw little philosophical stones at the cats. At noon, the wittiest syllogism and formulas run away from us, because on the other side of steep, damp wall hangs up just laundered, wet, dripping underwear.
Бібліотека. Ми шукаємо щонайточніших знань. Драбинами сходимо на вищі поверхи книгозбірні. Нишпоримо по стелажах спільно з павуками, зіймаючи кридяні хмари під стелею, мов на вершині стрімкої вежі. Почуваємося повітряними гімнастами, аж забиває дух і ледве втримуємо рівновагу. Поринаємо в найтонші томи без надії колись вибратися. Книги поглинають нас, як моря. Хапаємось руками за різьблені виступи. Сяк-так тримаємось на поверхні. І коли вже цілком під упадом на силі, засапані, обсипані штукатуркою, здається, знаходимо в гущавині сап'янів та коленкорів, притулене до стіни, легке й тепле гніздо вуличної ластівки.
Library. We look for the most precise knowledge. On ladders, we scale the highest floors of the library. We rummage through the stacks alongside spiders, raising chalk clouds under the ceiling, as if atop the steepest tower. We feel like aerial gymnasts, out of breath and barely keep our balance. We dive into the thickest volumes, no longer hoping to ever get out. The books consume us like the sea. We grip carved protrusions, barely able to stay afloat, and when we are about to run out of strength, sneezing and covered in plaster, it feels like success to find in the thickness of goatskin and leather, pressed tightly against the wall, the light and warm nest of a street swallow.
And two poems from a cycle which is called Lipnevі, начерки подорожнього. So July notes of the travelers.
Travelers' notes in July.
In July. Mm-hmm. So this is a cycle consisting of 10 poems, each of them about the city of Lviv, which is actually one of the topics which are always with me, and they were written at the end of 80s after our common adventures in that city, together with my closest friend, the poet Victor Neborak, who lives there, who is inhabitant of Lviv, has a big advantage comparing to me, because I can just visit Lviv and I cannot live there. But if I come to this city, I always find some new inspiration to write some next lines and pages, or at least next poem about Lviv. So it was the time when we spent the days and nights in that very hot July in Lviv downtown, in Старому місті, in the oldest part of the city, and it was quite a difficult time if we speak about water. Water was a constant problem of that beautiful city. There was always a huge lack of water, and so this problem has been solved some time ago, but the people nowadays cannot be happy anyway in that city. But the most important problem of the city has been solved very successfully. But you can feel, if you will read these poems, you can feel this. This is like big lack of water, which becomes a symbol of something which is more than water itself. Цвяхарня. Хтось сказав, ми не ті. Ми присутні в тунелях і вікнах. Але нам не дійти до старої цвяхарні за рогом. Зостається сідати на сходах, співати. Може, так подолаємо стіни, припнемо голоси до камінних цурпалків і витримо очі? Може, так і почують нас ті, що чекають за рогом? Зостається шукати себе і останній сірник, що в найдальшій кишені, колючий, як цвях.
As a native of Lviv, I naturally have very special feelings for this cycle. And second, many of what Yuri said. Nail factory. Someone said, we are not those ones. We are present in tunnels and windows, but cannot get to the old nail factory around the corner. It remains only to sit on the stairs and sing. Maybe this way we could overcome the walls, change the voices to a stony log, and wipe our eyes. Maybe this is how they will hear us, those who wait around the corner. It remains only to look for yourself, and the last match in the most remote pocket is as sharp as a nail.
Great. Дякую. Замок. Прогулянка кіньми. Велика приємність. Та нам зостаються лиш кухні в задвірках сецесій. Просторі прокурені гнізда, де гори немитого посуду і чаші з піщаними квітами, де у кранах сухих ледь пульсує волога зелених боліт. Посіймо попіл на стіл і пролиймо невипиті краплі. Брате, намацай отам на стіні вимикач. Я не бачу тебе, бо до ранку ще 300 хвилин. А панство і челядь поснули, і коні поснули, і нам не ввійти в ці кімнати. Вони небо кличуть.
Castle. A horse ride is a great pleasure, although we are left out with only the kitchen in the backyards of secession. Spacious, smoke-filled nests where mounds of dirty dishes and cups with gritty flowers, where in dry taps barely pulses the dampness of green puddles. Let's sow ash on a table and spill the unfinished drops. My brother, find a light switch on the wall. I can see you. We still have 300 minutes until morning. Masters and servants fell asleep, and horses fell asleep too, and we can't enter these rooms. They will not call us.
And now the last poem, which is beyond from the cycle about Lviv. The title is Pошуки, вертограду, and this is an attempt imagining how can it be the very last moment of our life. How can it look, this edge between life and death? Ще трохи, і ти збожеволієш від щастя продиратися крізь оці кущі. Суниця, повторюєш, малина, порічка, ожина, ліщина, агрус. І знову, як заклинання, спочатку. Сполохані птиці, деякий час покружлявши, сідають тобі на плечі. Мурахи повзуть угору стовбурами твоїх ніг. Ще трохи, і ти затремтиш від насолоди вмирати у цих кущах, гладячи теплих лисиць, які перебігають стежку. Ще трохи, і ти переступиш. Межа вертограду не видна. Її, можливо, й немає, хоча старий Петро стоїть, мов опудало, відганяючи від саду всіляку потолоч, охочу поласувати ябками. Твоє кружіння колись виявиться недаремним, залишаючи на шпичастих гілках рештки сорочки і шкіри, прослизнеш таки в найгустіші чертоги кисню і світла. Як і колись шепотітимеш, мов заклинання, бузина, калина, чорниця, шипшина, бузок. Впізнаватимеш кожен прожилок на листках, і кожну ягоду, і піщинку, бо всьому є своя назва, як на землі, так і на небі.
Searching for the garden. A bit more and you lose your mind from the joy of making your way through these shrubs. Strawberries, you repeat, raspberries, red currant, blackberry, hazel, gooseberry, and again, from the beginning, like an incantation. The alarm birds, after hovering for some time, sit on your shoulders. The ants crawl up the trunks of your legs. A bit more, and you'll start shaking out of the joy of dying in these shrubs, while caressing warm foxes that run across the path. A bit more, and you'll step over. The boundaries of the garden are invisible. Maybe they don't exist at all, although old Peter stands like a scarecrow and chases away from the garden all kinds of rebel, eager to feast on the apples. One day, your hoovering will appear to be meaningful. After leaving on the peaked branches the remnants of shirt and skin, you will slip into the densest chamber of air and light. You will be whispering as in the past, like an incantation. Elderberry, cranberry, blueberry, dog rose, lilac. You will recognize every thread on the leaves, every berry, and every grit, for everything has a name, both in the heavens and on earth. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, Остапе. Thank you very much.
We will return to our final excerpt from an essay before we move on to the question and answer period. And before we do that, I have a question, Yuri. The excerpt we're going to read is going to concern a certain circus that has been present in all the genres that you write in. I believe, and it's the Cirk Vagabundo, the Vagabundo circus, which first I believe appeared in a poem by that name,
Right.
From this period that we just read now, and then it appeared in this essay that we'll be reading now. That's from essay about Lviv, which we'll be reading the excerpt from, which is from the book The Travel. But then also it's quite prevalent in your latest novel. So Vagabundo, I was looking for the origins of this word, and is it true that it's a Galician word, but not Galician as in but Galician as in
It's
Spanish?
an international word.
Yes, but the roots they say that. So it's traveling, of course, a vagabond. But in your early works, it seems to offer some kind of color, some kind of illusion, escape from this gray world, like a lot of your early poems do. And there's also a sense of some kind of community, of something that existed before the Soviet period, and you hint that it will outlast the Soviet period. It will be eternal, as opposed to this. Has a very Eastern European flavor to it.
And yeah, it moves from one chapter of this novel to the next one. It is always here, somehow like an opposite to the system of justice, because we can imagine a trial, a very, very serious process, as a kind of show of circus too, and this is a kind of metaphor for this newest novel, this opposition between official justice, official trial, and this wandering circus.
We should be careful. We have a former prosecutor here who just gave a lecture about the rule of law in Ukraine. But how has this circus changed? Because you've been using it, you've been referring to it in various works, like I said, since the mid-'80s. Ukraine has, you mentioned that Lviv, at least, when you wrote those poems, there was a water issue. Water was rationed. It was quite a great place. It's obviously much more colorful now. How has the function of this circus changed at all? Or is it to say, is it constant? Is that the fact that's important, that it doesn't change with Ukraine?
I would say it is something which is constant, and in that meaning, it is a kind of my personal myth, something which repeats all the time, and what is very interesting in different times, in different epochs, in different social, political circumstances. There is always this circus, which is always somehow ambiguous. You can think, oh, they just create miracles, they are just magicians, but by the next meeting, you get an impression they are just liars, and they are not, they are вони шахраї, як сказати шахраї? They are like
swindlers.
Swindlers, right? Swindlers, and they are quite cheap and nasty people. Yeah. And they have some connection with the mob, with some very doubtful powers in that world, always in each century, in 16th century, in 20th century, they are like eternal domination of Central Eastern Europe. But they are funny. And this is the great thing in that circus. I'm not sure I stopped writing about them with the finishing of this novel. Maybe I will be back to my favorite circus in some of my next books.
So now we'll hear an excerpt from the essay on review.
But I noted it is quite long, maybe, but we still have.
Yeah,
no, we don't have this translation.
No, we do.
Yeah. Okay, then maybe quickly.
Starts with.
Yeah. Місто Цирк.
Oh no, it's то починається з того часу, пам'ятаєш?
Приблизно в той самий час.
Around that time.
Тобто ближче до середини 17 століття. У Львові вперше зупиняється мандрівний цирк Вагабундо, напрочуд барвисте інтернаціональне зборище всіляких унікумів, яке відтоді ще протягом 300 років не покидає меж Центральної Європи, іноді, щоправда, зникаючи на цілі декади. Усе, що загалом відомо про цирк, можна викласти кількома реченнями. Його структура була династійною, таким чином його актори століттями носили одні й ті самі прізвища. Директори ж завжди призначались інвестором, особою, що її ніхто й ніколи не бачив. Кажуть, наче вона заправляла всім, сидячи безвилазно десь у швейцарському кантоні Валліс, на батьківщині циркового ремесла. Останній із директорів, Ананда, вчинив нечуваний переворот і, скинувши тодішнього інвестора, заволодів цирком особисто. Але це трапилося напередодні остаточного краху, коли всій трупі довелося рятуватися від політичних репресій утечею за океан. Роман про їхні останні часи міг би називатися просто «Цирк Вагабундо». Починатися ж він міг би так. Аномалії мандрували світом і ніяк не могли оминути Львова. Аномалії тяглися до найбільшої аномалії, що звалася Львовом. З Лемового високого замку випливає, що він у своєму дитинстві бачив останніх могікан з Вагабундо. Він пам'ятає, як Подвір'ями того часу кружляли незліченні штукарі, пожирачі вогню, акробати, співаки і музики, а також справжнісінькі катеринники, з котрих не один мав навіть папугу, що витягав папірці з ворожбою. Річ у тому, що на описуваний Лемом період від цирку було відлучено певне число акторів. Відлучені самозванці, саме про них роман, заволодівають цирковим архівом, у якому зібрано магічні інструкції щодо чаклунських і гіпнотичних сеансів, таємні плани підземних сполучень у в'язницях, монастирях, фортецях і банках 111 найважливіших міст, десятки мап, саморобних і друкованих, із зазначеннями місць, де закопано найлегендарніші скарби, тисячі сторінок компромату на чільних міських діячів і політиків усіх епох. Інша езотерика, як, наприклад, чарівні палички, вінілові диски з голосами духів, відьомські люстерка, в яких можна оглядати порноролики, корені мандрагори, зібрані під шибеницями на Гіцлівській горі. Архів цирку Вагабундо увесь міститься в одній валізі. Зрозуміло, що це найцінніша валіза на світі. Продовжувати? Тут знову доречно згадати свідчення Станіслава Лема, який пише про мініатюрні мандрівні цирки від Чорного ходу, що здатні поміститися з усім реквізитом, фехтувальні булави, гирі, меч для ковтання, в одній єдиній, до того ж добряче потертій валізі із штучної шкіри. До речі, такі валізки я бачив ще наприкінці 60-х, але тоді їх носили вже тільки божевільні. За валізою з архівом, ясна річ, полюють. При цьому існує щонайменше 4 сторони, які прагнуть її перехопити. Це Служба безпеки, приватне детективне бюро, індійський брахман-проповідник і нащадки першого інвестора. Самозванці, яким щоразу вдається вислизнути і замести сліди, врешті настільки заплутуються у власних конспіративних заходах, що гублять валізку десь на міському звалищі, неподалік Збиранки і Грибовичів, де її розтягують бомжі. У романі місто перетвориться на перманентний гіпнотичний сеанс або суцільний атракціон, підозріло дешевий і демократично загальнодоступний, з парковими оркестрами, джазом, першим звуковим кінематографом та механічними ляльками. Місто в романі – це запаморочливі каруселі, палац привидів, бочка сміху, криві дзеркала, незліченні кіоски та кабінети, де скуповуються наївні й зачаровані душі приміського пролетаріату. В останній сцені цирк виявиться блошиним, а всі перипетії роману – галюцинацією хворого скарлатиною школяра, що, прогулюючи уроки в лунапарку, забрів до павільйону розваг і задивився на шоу дресированих бліг.
Okay, and now we'll open up the floor if you maybe have some questions to Yuri or to Ostap, or to me for that matter. Ask away. Yes, please.
The Carpathian Mountains, are they something personal to you, or what inspired you to write about them originally?
May I ask you once again?
Yeah, sure. The Carpathian Mountains?
Yep.
From the first essay?
Mhm.
What inspired you to write about them?
Actually, I live in the city which is quite close to the mountains, some 60-80 kilometers. So if you have some of the first really sunny and transparent days in the beginning of spring, you can see the mountains as some line, skyline, in a blue color. and then you remember the beautiful phrase written by Joseph Roth. He called it the first blue promises of Carpathians, looking into this prospect. And for me, it is my childhood, of course. I was always traveling in that direction together with my parents, then later with my friends. As we were the students, we always spent some time with tents and with guitars in the same area, and then I discovered some fantastic object there, which used to be a ruin, but nowadays it is partly renovated. It is an old observatory built so at the end of 1920s, beginning of 1930s, by Polish and Czechoslovak governments. They decided to have some new, very modern observatory on the very border between those two states. And it worked, unfortunately, it worked just very short time, as we know, just till the Second War. Afterwards, it became a ruin. So it was a place where I visited it since the middle of 90s constantly. I needed to be there and to find some new inspirations and new ideas for my writings. And the first appearance of this object is in the same essay I read first tonight, but then I have developed this motif in my novel 12 Circles. And, I have changed just one thing. It is in the novel. It is not the same observatory. It is a kind of station, but it is a meteorology station. But the place is very, very similar to the real place. So it is a long story, and I read an excerpt devoted to the music. So it is a complex for me. It exists as some complex of natural and human creations, Carpathians.
You know, you mentioned that they're renovating it now, this observatory?
Yes. I forgot to stress it. There is a very interesting common project of University of Warsaw from Poland and our university from Ivano-Frankivsk, from the city where I live. Two universities try to renew everything there and to recreate this place to some new purposes, like an international base for the students and scholars discovering Carpathians as an organism. So some kind of center of CARPATOLOGIA. Yeah.
Yes, here, and then, yeah.
I have two questions. One is, what is the current state of book publishing in Ukraine in comparison to 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And the second question is, are there any authors of essays that during your lifetime you have found to be particularly attractive or influential in terms of your own essay writing?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I'm afraid I can exaggerate the situation with book publishing in today's Ukraine, but I would call it blossoming. I can compare what we had even 10 years ago, and I can see, not just me, we, all of us, the writers and the publishers, we see something like huge interest of audience, of readers. Actually, the appearance of some new readers generation. The young people, normally they are students, but they are also. It's not necessarily they are the students, but they are visiting the readings, the bookstores, the festivals, and the book fairs. The book fairs in Ukraine become more and more popular, and they are organized not just in two cities like Lviv and the capital city of Kyiv, but they are in different places now, and actually each bigger city in Ukraine tries to establish its own book fair. If you visit some decent bookstore in Ukraine, you can note something which was unthinkable some years ago. I mean, huge diversity and variety of the titles and of topics, and there is a lot of translations, because we don't speak just about fiction or poetry. We have to speak about philosophy, sociology, and other disciplines. And my first impression now, as I'm trespassing some bookstore in Ukraine, that my first impression, my first idea is so many books. Who needs so many books? But probably it is the sign of very positive situation in that meaning. As I know, the book market in the world today is shrinking, and our situation could be so optimistic just because of our former stagnation, and that we were very regressive in that meaning. So we are growing now, but it could be just because of our former відставання.
Lagging behind, yeah.
Yeah, lagging behind.
And the second question?
And the second question, yes, about the authors who had the biggest impact on me. I would say the beautiful school of Polish essayistic. I mean, first of all, the essays by Zbigniew Herbert and Czesław Miłosz, but then later the writers who belong to the same generation, like me, like the friend of mine, Andrzej Stasiuk. So this is one tradition, and the other one would be the I would call it German-speaking tradition. So I mean German and first of all Austrian authors of essays, which created some, I would say, some parameters, some model of what this genre should be. And I speak now about the writers from this post-war time, 1950s and 60s, the school of German-speaking authors.
Miroslav.
I was very much interested in your talk today, what I consider to be two sources, European sources, Pripyat and the Carpathian Mountains. Pripyat, of course, is a source for Slavs. Those of us who are linguists, the first things that we learned was that central area has been considered by the English as the origins of the Slavs, from which they spread out to the whole territory. And then the second is the Carpathian Mountains, and particularly Rahim, the area of Rahim, where I not long ago read, I don't know what possessed me to look for it, but I looked in the encyclopedia, that it is considered by some scholars or historians as the center of Europe. And I find that fascinating, because there is something additionally magical about it. There is another place, somewhere in the Alps, I think, that is also taken into consideration. But Rahim, in the Rahim area, perhaps near Yasigna, somewhere in that area.
There is a village called 𝐃𝐞𝐚𝐝. And in that village, there is a geographical center of Europe. It's not some fictional idea of historians. It is geographical fact. The geographers of Austrian-Hungarian Empire made this measuring somewhere in 1870s, and they found this place. So there is a pillar from that time, and on the pillar there is an inscript in Latin language about this place, which is constant, eternal, and means the center of the Europe. And it is, of course, the thing which can make us, all of us, very proud, being so close to the center of Europe. But actually, Europe is a very strange continent, and there is like 70 places where the local people are sure the center of Europe is here. And I know the very good documentary film made by Polish director Stanisław Mucha, and the name is in German is Mitte, so middle, and he discovered this phenomenon. So he he went to each of these 70 places, and he made some documentation. He spoke to the people there, and so he demonstrates how proud the people are always being in the center of Europe. And you can visit the center of Europe in Germany, in the area of Frankfurt-Main. Then you can visit it in Austria, and this is the place on Danube called Braunau, with very bad background, because it is the place where Hitler was born. And then you can find the next European center in Lithuania, then in Belarusia, and then you can find it somewhere in Greece and somewhere in Albania. And the people are ready to fight. The local people are ready to fight for this, defending this idea, no, we are the center of Europe. So we do the same, actually, with Rachiv, because there was, besides of that very first pillar, which has been erected in Austrian times, there was a Soviet one, 10 meters on the side of the, because it was more precise measured, the second one. But since the beginning of 90s, there is the most correct pillar in the very middle between these two, and this is Ukrainian sign of the center, of European center.
The true center. Any other questions? What do you have?
I just finished your book today, the Kоханці Юстиції. It's a wonderful read. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
It struck me that the geography of it is so much Western Ukrainian, right? There are some moments with Wyszynski that happen in Moscow, Germany, but it's primarily Western Ukraine. And you go back in history. Most of the book is really going back in history. And a lot of Western Ukrainian writers do quite very similar historical narratives. So Malarchuk, Yuri Andrukhovych, it seems like Western Ukrainian writers are much more obsessed with the history, and the Eastern Ukrainian writers are like trying to find the ground in the current kind of world. Why is there such a difference between how these two kind of poles of the Ukraine and the literary world in Ukraine approach Ukrainian identity?
I think this is a question to some literary observers, to some critics, because I'm a participant of the process. I cannot be objective, but I wrote this novel since 1990, so 27 years. I cannot say I was working all the time just on that book. Moreover, I would say, as I wrote the first and then the second chapter, I didn't know that it is going to be a novel. I was thinking I just write some stories, some short stories about about some bastards, about some persons who were evaluated by society and system of justice as the last sinners, criminals and bastards. And my idea was to find for all of them some reasons, some hope, some excuse. And so I never thought I write some historic novel. It wasn't my aim. After I decided to unite all of these stories into one book, and this book should be a novel, I never thought it should be a historic novel. So I found some term para-historic novel, and it is a kind of a sign. I mean, it is about contemporariness. It is about our time and our problems nowadays. But I suspect there is a very attractive possibility writing some historic or parahistoric text for each writer. There is a biggest attraction could be the kind of reconstruction and the possibility to work with some sources, with archives, and to refantasize them. And I think it is the big privilege of the writers you mentioned before, to get this experience, this drive, I would say, to recreate the sources, the documents, the real facts. Like Sofia Andruchowicz, I can speak about her because I was a little bit a witness how did she write her novel Felix Austria. She used a lot of newspapers of that time, not the works of historians, but the newspapers. They give you the beautiful possibility to feel the smells of the times. For example, the advertising. And it is just a kind of writer's world to get some advertising or some small and short report or notice in some old newspaper, and to create the world around this small notice.
We have time for another question. Any questions? Yeah.
I guess I want to continue on the geographical theme. Most readers would connect you with a kind of Western Ukrainian tradition. Do you find that as you obviously you do readings all across Ukraine, do you find that there are distinctive responses to you in different places in terms of like how you're received by either by audiences or by reviewers?
I don't have these problems with different regions of Ukraine. I can say there is a kind of difference, but I would say that if I visit some places in Ukrainian East, I meet there the audience, which is how to say, more enthusiastic. So they are always very thankful, and they are very attentive, and they react in a very enthusiastic way. And if I have some presentation or just some reading, let's say in my favorite Lviv or in Ivano-Frankivsk or somewhere in western part, I just see the people who are okay. They are just accustomed to be a part of audience, and they are sometimes too much bored by the same Ukrainian writers, and So I think I don't see the literature without some regional and local specifics. And for example, back to Kоханці Юстиції, we have, by the way, some copies here, and I can sign them after our meeting. Some people reacted in the beginning after the book has been published, in the beginning of this book's life. They reacted in the way, I wouldn't read it because it is always about Western Ukraine, about Galicia, and I don't want to read it from that reason. And I wonder if somebody reacted in that way, let's say, on James Joyce, saying, I don't want to read it because it's always about Dublin, and I don't want to read about Dublin. So actually, this is something which means place. And the place for a writer is extremely important. It is also extremely important to have many places, but there is always let's say the most important, or the place where you are home, and this is the normal thing to come back to this place and to this atmosphere and moods and stories from that place.
We have another question.
Some 10 years ago or so, it was very much in vogue to speak about nostalgia for an empire.
Which one?
Well, empire.
Empire, just
in this particular case, it would be Austria. The way I understood it, I saw it as the yearning or the desire for an assertion that we are Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I never understood it as, at least I never interpreted it, and I had some discussions on that question with individuals who were very much fascinated by this issue. I have not, I think it's out of fashion to speak about it now. My impression is that by now, as far as Ukrainian writers are concerned, they feel themselves to be in Europe. Is that your, how would you comment on that?
Yeah, I just agree. I just agree with your observation. There is no common position of all Ukrainian writers concerning Europe, but of course this European or pro-European discourse is dominating in Ukraine today. So not just the writers, but there are just very few of them. Not very few, but let's say there are some 12 or 15 writers who have this newest experience being in Europe and considering Ukraine as a part of Europe in cultural meaning, first of all, but it is a hope for the future political presence in European organism. And there is a majority of Ukrainian writers, huge, big majority, maybe thousands of them, who never been to Europe, I mean to Western Europe, to normal Europe, and they can have some just some cliches and some simple ideas about what it is. So I wouldn't generalize this situation, but the normal idea of each Ukrainian today, or maybe of most of them, is we're trying to change our lives and our being as a state, as a country, into European way. So it's actually mostly very positive, and it means some hope, some idea about the future.
We have time for one more question. Anybody who hasn't asked a question, I will.
I'd like to jump back to this kind of city thing. How do you spend your time in New York, and did you write something in the U.S.?
Yes, this is a good question, because I could read some pages from the chapter about New York, which is one of my intimate cities too, but altogether they are 111 cities of the world, and some of them are presented in that book in a very short way, just 3 or 4 sentences. If I spend in that city just 2 hours being at the station there or something, the text will be short. But yeah, like for example Yanakieva not being in that city at all. But New York is one of the most important cities in that book, and the most important cities of course have the longest chapters in that book. So my New York chapter is one of the longest here, and the main story is about 1998. I was here for the first time, and I met a friend from Ukraine who was an artist, a painter, and we were the students together in Lviv. We studied together, and I was always sure he is a genius, and he has a brilliant future of one of the biggest artists of our time. But as I met him here in New York, he was living here since the beginning of 90s, and it was just our day that we spent together walking on Broadway. And he was telling me all the time, he was telling me about his life here, about his despair, about his catastrophes. And I had an impression he kept silence since he came to New York, some 7 or 8 years long, and now he meets somebody he can tell about his catastrophes. So this is actually not about the city, it's actually about him, but the city of New York is the only possible arena, or only possible scene for that story. He doesn't live anymore, and Actually, as I wrote this chapter, he was already somewhere in other dimension, but it was a kind of homage for him.
Okay, just one quick question and we need to wrap up. Yes?
Just to come back into this dimension, and that is, you are the most well-known writer in Europe today, certainly in Germany, and I would like to have your own perception of yourself and your own position as a European writer in the context of those experiences that you have had living in Europe and working in Europe and associating yourself with the literary world of that world.
No, I'm living in Ukraine. I just visit some European countries, especially if they publish something written of mine. But of course, I spent some longer periods of time in Germany or in Austria, in Switzerland too, and I have good connections to different groups of the people there who write, who publish, who discuss the European matters. And I would say I don't have the very good, very deep and fruitful, productive experience with other European cultures like French or Spanish or even English, although my books were published in translations to all of these languages too. So I cannot be responsible for being a European writer at all, generally. I know the situation of the writers in Germany, let's say, and I used the same possibilities like they use sometimes, getting some awards or grants or stipends for writing, and I think I could find there some close friends who understood me very good, and we initiated a few projects. But I always thought, and it was true, that anyway I come back to Ukraine, and there will be still a kind of feeling being foreigner there. I had to change the language to be the part of that country or of that culture. I know that one example is the young writer from the same city like me, whose name is Tanja Malarchuk. You probably know Tanja Malarchuk, very good. So she is gradually she's moving to the being of German-speaking writer, because she changed her life very radically. She married an Austrian and she moved to Vienna without any word in German, but now she writes, and she writes very well in German. She published her 2 or 3 books in Ukrainian, living in Vienna, and she wrote them in Vienna, but the newest texts by her are written in German. And I think she will slowly come to German-speaking writing. So it is a normal situation for each writer, but if you don't live in that language longer time, you cannot change to that language.
But you are being translated, right?
Yes, yes. If I'm translated into German, I cooperate with my translator very good, and I can improve some things. I can find some mistakes, some misunderstandings, but I wouldn't translate my works myself. Never, never.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up. Just a couple notes. In the back we have copies of My Final Territory for sale, and here Yuri will have some of his Ukrainian language books and an audiobook for sale if anyone's interested. To any students out there haven't taken my course, I'll be teaching contemporary Ukrainian literature course next semester. We'll be scrutinizing the works of Yuri Andrukhovych and other Ukrainian literary luminaries. And I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and let's thank Yuri for a wonderful presentation.
Дуже дякую.
Дякую.